The first thing Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Müller felt was the vibration. It began as a subtle hum through the leather-padded soles of his boots, transmitted up through the steel deck plates of the UMNS 612, a deep, resonant thrumming that was the heartbeat of the Type WWII submarine. He stood in the control room, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers, the blue-gray smoke curling up to join the permanent haze of sweat, diesel, and stale air. The chronometer on the bulkhead read 3:17. It was April 20th, 1943. Somewhere above them, the black, storm-tossed waters of the North Atlantic heaved. Through the voice tube from the radio room came a report, the Funkmacht's voice tinny and precise. Sparks from convoy HX-229, Herr Oberleutnant. Bearing 285, range estimated 25 kilometers. Heavy merchant traffic. Escort signatures faint. Possibly a single corvette. A slow, confident smile spread across Müller's face. At 28, he was a veteran of 7 patrols, with over 120,000 tons of Allied shipping to his name, a Ritter Cruise winner whose photograph had been in the Berliner Illustrierte Zeitung. He took a final drag and crushed the cigarette into an ashtray bolted to the chart table. "Very good," he said, his voice calm. "Battle stations. Prepare for surface attack. We will go in under the cover of the squall." Around him, the boat came alive with a quiet, efficient urgency. Men moved to their positions, the hydrophone operator donning his headphones, the chief engineer monitoring his banks of dials, the torpedo mates in the forward compartment preparing their deadly fish. There was no panic, only the focused anticipation of hunters who knew their prey was helpless. Lieutenant Zur C. Klaus Berger, the boat's first watch officer and Müller's friend, leaned over the chart. A fat convoy hands. Like shooting fish in a barrel, their escorts are a joke, a single old corvette, probably still using a sailor with a bucket on a rope to listen for us. Müller nodded, studying the intercepted bearings. "The Tommies are stretched thin. And the Americans," he chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "They send their merchantmen out painted gray and call it a navy. They have no patience for the Kriegsmarine, no understanding of the hunt. They are warehouse clerks playing at war." This belief was not arrogance. It was doctrine, reinforced by 2 years of devastating success. Since the fall of France, the U-boats of Admiral Dönnitz's Rudel tactic, the Wolfpack, had brought Britain to the brink of starvation. The happy time of 1940–41 had seen entire convoys slaughtered. The Allied escorts were few, their technology primitive. ASDIC, the British sonar, was notoriously finicky in rough seas. Depth charges were often dropped in patterns a skilled commander could evade. The Atlantic, vast and dark, belonged to the Grey Wolves. And the Americans, their entry into the war had been a gift. Their coastal shipping, lit up like carnival midways, had been sunk within sight of beachgoers in what U-boat crews called the second happy time. Their escorts were inexperienced, their tactics clumsy. The UMNS 612 had sunk 3 American tankers off Florida just 4 months prior, watching the flames paint the night sky orange as they slipped away unscathed. Müller ran a hand over the stubble on his chin. "They build things, the Americans, refrigerators, automobiles. They do not build warriors, and they certainly do not build anything that can find us in this." He gestured vaguely upward toward the storm raging on the surface. The boat rolled gently in the deep ocean swell. To him, it was a cloak of invincibility. What Müller could not know, as he gave the order to surface, and his boat broke into the howling, rain-lashed night, was that the calculus of the Atlantic War had already shifted. The reports on his desk at BDU, a Befehlshaber der U-boot headquarters, the intelligence summaries that spoke of Allied desperation, were already dangerously obsolete. They were based on a reality that was ceasing to exist. While he prepared to stalk convoy HX-229, a technological and industrial revolution was converging on the mid-Atlantic. A silent, invisible net being woven from 1,000 threads of American ingenuity, British perseverance, and Polish mathematics. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and the weapon that would doom them wasn't a bigger gun or a faster ship. It was a machine that could see in the dark, think faster than a man, and coordinate a killing blow from over the horizon. And its first, terrible test was already underway. The confidence of the Kriegsmarine in the spring of 1943 was built on a foundation of hard-won success and carefully cultivated myth. The U-boat arm was the elite, the undersea knights of the Third Reich. Theirs was a war of individual skill, courage, and Teutonic technical superiority. The Type WWII was a masterpiece of engineering, compact, agile, and deadly. Its crews were volunteers, put through a brutal training regimen that washed out more than half of all candidates. They believed they were better. Intelligence from the WWII and BDU's own analysis fed this confidence. Allied shipbuilding capacity was acknowledged, but its products were dismissed as Liberty ships, slow, poorly made vessels that were little more than floating coffins, easy targets. Estimates of American escort production were laughably low. A February 1943 BDU memo concluded that even with its massive industrial base, the United States could not possibly produce more than 60 modern destroyer escorts per year, and those would be needed in the vast Pacific. The Atlantic would remain a German lake. The cultural prejudice was profound. German naval commanders, products of a tradition that valued theoretical mastery and tactical brilliance, viewed their American counterparts as amateurs. Captured Allied manuals were studied and derided for their simplistic language. American naval officers were seen as businessmen in uniform, lacking the Fingerspitzengefühl, the fingertip feel, of a true seaman. A widely circulated report from a U-boat commander who had observed U.S. Navy exercises in 1941 described their anti-submarine tactics as unimaginative and rigid, like a grocer following a recipe. Technically, the comparison seemed to favor the Germans. The standard Allied anti-submarine weapon in early 1943 was the depth charge, a barrel of explosives rolled or launched off the stern of a ship. Its killing radius was small, and it required the escort to be almost directly overhead. The German Pillenwerfer could release a chemical decoy that mimicked a submarine's acoustic signature, leading depth charges astray. Allied ASDIC sonar pulsed a narrow ping that could be avoided by a sharp turn once contact was made. German hydrophones were among the best in the world, allowing a U-boat to listen for its pursuers. On paper, and in the experience of men like Müller, the advantage was clear. A U-boat could slip under a convoy at night, fire a spread of torpedoes from its bow and stern tubes, and dive deep before the escorts even knew they were under attack. The Greenland Gap, the area beyond the range of land-based aircraft, was a sanctuary where the wolf packs ruled. There were, however, whispers. A few voices within the Kriegsmarine raised cautious alarms. Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schnee, an ace commander, had returned from a patrol in late 1942 deeply troubled. He reported that Allied air cover seemed to be extending further into the Atlantic, and that escorts appeared to be gaining contact with U-boats with surprising, almost prescient, speed. His after-action report suggested the Allies might be developing new detection methods. It was reviewed at BDU and filed under unsubstantiated anecdotal evidence. The prevailing wisdom was that the Allies were simply getting luckier, or that German radio traffic was being monitored more closely. Another officer, Fregattenkapitän Victor Ohen, a brilliant staff officer at BDU, had begun to notice disturbing statistical anomalies. The tonnage sunk per U-boat at sea was beginning to decline in the latter half of 1942. The number of U-boats lost was creeping upward. He drafted a memorandum suggesting a tactical pause, a withdrawal to analyze these trends and develop countermeasures. Admiral Dönitz, under immense pressure from Hitler to strangle Britain, rejected it outright. The offensive would continue with greater force. The tonnage slacked, the tonnage war, would be won by sheer numbers of U-boats. In January 1943, Dönitz had over 200 operational submarines. He believed the tipping point was near. What Owen's graphs could not show, what Schnee's instincts could not prove, was that the Allies were not just getting luckier. They were getting smarter, and they were doing so on a scale that defied German comprehension. The isolated data points, a U-boat sunk in a sudden, coordinated attack far from any escort, a wolf pack finding a convoy inexplicably rerouted, an aircraft appearing out of low cloud where none should have been, were not random. They were the first tremors of an earthquake. The Germans were analyzing the war they had been fighting since 1940. The Allies were fighting the war of 1943, a war built in secret laboratories and on frenetic factory floors thousands of miles from the freezing North Atlantic. While U-boat commanders smoked and joked about American refrigerator mechanics, the reality taking shape was of a different order entirely. The American response to the U-boat threat was not merely to build more ships, but to reinvent the very process of hunting them. It was a marriage of mass production, cutting-edge science, and organizational genius that would become the template for modern warfare. At the heart of this revolution was a machine with a deceptively simple name, the Hedgehog. To the German engineers who would later study its wreckage, it looked like a bizarre porcupine. But its genesis was one of sheer desperation and brilliant physics. The depth charge's fatal flaw was that it was dropped after a submarine was lost on ASDIC contact during the final attack run. A British naval officer, Lieutenant Commander Charles Goodeve, had a radical idea: fire the weapon ahead of the ship, so it landed where the submarine would be. The Hedgehog was a spigot mortar that launched a pattern of 24 small contact-fused bombs in an elliptical pattern 250 yards ahead of the firing ship. They sank quickly and only exploded if they actually hit the submarine's hull. It was a weapon that demanded precision, but in the right hands, it was murderously effective. Yet the Hedgehog was just one claw of the beast. The true nightmare for the U-boat was emerging from the drawing boards of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the factories of General Electric and Western Electric. It was called the Lee Light, paired with the ASV, air-to-surface vessel, radar. For the first 2 years of the war, the U-boat's greatest vulnerability was on the surface, where it had to recharge its batteries and run at speed to intercept convoys. At night, it was virtually invisible. The ASV radar, mounted on long-range Liberator and Catalina aircraft, changed that. It could detect a submarine's conning tower from miles away, but the early radar was imprecise. A pilot would often lose the target in the final, critical approach. The Lee Light solved this. A powerful 24-inch searchlight mounted in the aircraft's belly that would be switched on at the last moment, illuminating the U-boat like a startled rabbit in headlights, just as depth charges or rockets were released. The production numbers behind these systems were staggering, and they represented a second, parallel revolution. While German industry under Albert Speer was finally hitting its stride, it was focused on quality and complexity. The intricate machining of a U-boat's diesel engine, the precision optics of a periscope. American industry focused on volume and simplification. The Liberty ship, once derided, was being produced at a rate that seemed supernatural. At the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, the record for building a Liberty ship from keel laying to launch was set at 4 days, 15 hours and 26 minutes. By 1943, they were launching 3 ships a day. For every U-boat Dönitz sent to sea, American yards were launching a dozen merchant vessels. The escort building program was even more telling. The destroyer escort DE was not a glamorous warship. It was smaller, slower, and cheaper than a fleet destroyer, but it was perfect for convoy duty. The design was standardized and farmed out to factories that had never built warships. The Federal Shipbuilding and Drydock Company, the Brown Shipbuilding in Houston, the Bethlehem Steel Yards, they churned them out like sausages. The initial goal of 60 DEs per year was surpassed before the first hull was even wet. The actual production for 1943 would be over 300. Each one was a platform for hedgehogs, depth charge racks, and most importantly, new electronics. And then there was the secret, the one that not even most Allied escort commanders fully understood, the breaking of the Enigma code. The German naval Enigma, with its four-rotor machine, was believed to be unbreakable. But at Bletchley Park in England, a team of mathematicians, linguists, and engineers, including the visionary Alan Turing, had built the bomb, an electromechanical computer that could crack the daily settings. When coupled with captured codebooks and the sheer intellectual effort of thousands of people, it gave the Allies a window into Dönitz' very mind. They could read his orders to the wolf packs, reroute convoys around them, and vector hunter-killer groups directly onto unsuspecting U-boats. This was the system coalescing in the spring of 1943, a vast, interconnected web of intelligence long-range aircraft liberators with Lee lights, mass-produced escorts DEs, and new weapons Hedgehog. It was a system designed not to duel with U-boats, but to annihilate them by making the ocean transparent. The Germans, masters of the tactical duel, were utterly unprepared for a strategic system of systems. They were still looking for a better sword. The Allies had built a cage. The first cracks in the German facade appeared not as catastrophic defeats, but as puzzling, frustrating anomalies. They were the kind of reports that, in isolation, could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that a less confident, less pressured command might have recognized as catastrophic. In early March 1943, UMNS 333, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Peter Rerich Kremer, was stalking a convoy south of Iceland. It was a clear night with a bright moon. Kremer, a seasoned ace, had maneuvered into a perfect attack position on the surface. Suddenly, without warning, a British Wellington bomber was upon him. There was no sound of an engine until the last moment. Then a blinding white light erupted from the sky, pinning the U-boat in its glare. Depth charges rained down. UMNS 333 was badly damaged and only narrowly escaped. Kremer's report was adamant. The aircraft had found him without searchlights, in total darkness from several kilometers away. BDU's technical branch concluded he had been caught by a patrol aircraft using moonlight, and the light was a standard flare. Kremer knew better. He had seen no flare. He had seen a steady, piercing beam that switched on from directly above. His report was marked U-boat commander error in judgment of situation. Then came the escorts that seemed to know too much. UMNS 432 was shadowing convoy SC-122 in mid-March. The weather was poor, visibility low. The U-boat was running submerged, using its hydrophones. According to the hydrophone operator's log, he heard the distinct propeller sounds of a single corvette approaching from the east. The captain, Kapitänleutnant Hermann Eckhart, ordered a turn to starboard and a decrease in depth to avoid the expected depth charge run. Instead of passing overhead, the corvette altered course precisely, staying directly above them. Then came a new sound, a series of sharp metallic plunks hitting the water, not from the stern, but from ahead of the ship. Seconds later, 6 muffled explosions shook the boat. One of the Hedgehog bombs had struck the forward torpedo room. UMNS 432 sank with all hands. No distress signal was sent. To BDU, it simply disappeared. Another loss chalked up to unknown causes, possibly operational accident. The radio traffic itself began to feel wrong. The complex Heimisch Hydra cipher used by U-boats was changed regularly, but there were unsettling incidents. A wolfpack, Lerwenhers, was directed to intercept convoy HX-228 in a specific grid square. They found nothing. Later decrypted Allied signals, captured from a downed aircraft, suggested the convoy had changed course at the last moment, after the wolfpack's orders had been transmitted. Coincidence, said BDU's Signals Intelligence Unit. The Allies had good direction finding. That was all. Perhaps the most ominous warnings came from the few successful commanders who returned from patrols in what was now being called the Air Gap, with a new sense of dread. Kapitänleutnant Siegfried von Forstner of UMNS 402 reported in April that he had been forced to dive no less than 12 times in a single day by aircraft, not just in the expected zones near land, but in the middle of the Atlantic, over 600 miles from the nearest airfield. "The sky is no longer ours," he wrote in a private letter to a fellow commander that was intercepted by the Gestapo and forwarded to the Navy. "They are everywhere, and they see in the dark." The letter earned him a stern reprimand for defeatism. The psychological mechanism at BDU and among the U-boat fleet was a classic case of cognitive dissonance. To accept that the Allies had developed radar small enough for aircraft, a weapon that attacked from ahead, and possibly broken the Enigma code, would be to accept that the entire foundation of U-boat strategy was crumbling. It was easier, less terrifying, to blame individual misfortune, crew error, or bad luck. The momentum of past success was too great. The pressure from Berlin for results was too intense. The truth was a phantom, glimpsed in fragments by men at the sharp end, dismissed by the men with the maps and the promotions. Meanwhile, the system was being perfected. In Derry, Northern Ireland, a secret training base known as HMS Ferret was turning out escort groups that practiced with hedgehogs and the latest high-frequency direction-finding, HF/DF, or Huff-Duff, gear. These groups, with names like B-2, B-3, and the legendary captain-class frigates of the first escort group, were no longer just shepherds. They were hunters, and they were being fed the richest intelligence in history via Ultra. They knew where the U-boats were going before the U-boats did. By late April 1943, the stage was set. Convoy on Sminus 5, a slow westbound convoy of 43 merchant ships, was about to sail into the path of the largest wolf pack yet assembled. Over 40 U-boats in groups Drossel, Amsel, and Specht. The Allies knew they were coming. For the first time, all the new tools, the long-range B-24 Liberators from Iceland and Newfoundland, the veteran escort groups with their hedgehogs, and the priceless flow of Ultra, would be tested in a single, brutal confrontation. The Germans, smelling blood, prepared for another great victory. They had no idea they were sailing into a meticulously prepared trap, one where their every move was anticipated and their greatest strength, their numbers, would become their greatest vulnerability. For Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Müller on UMNS 612, the war was still the one he knew. The storm that had hidden his approach to convoy HX-229 was now clearing, revealing a breathtaking spectacle under a canopy of fading stars. From the bridge of the rolling U-boat, the cold salt spray stinging his face, he could see them. Dozens of ships, their dark hulls silhouetted against the pre-dawn gray, plodding westward in neat columns. The smell of salt and diesel was sharp in his nostrils. He raised his binoculars, scanning the perimeter. There, a single, small silhouette plowing along the port flank. A Flower-class corvette, its silhouette unmistakable. Maybe a second one far on the starboard side, nothing more. "Perfect," he breathed, the words snatched away by the wind. He turned to the voice tube. "Radio room, transmit contact report. Convoy HX-229, grid square B27, course 285, speed 8 knots. Request concentration of Falk group." He would shadow, report, and wait for the pack to gather. Then the slaughter would begin. It was the drill. It had always worked. Down in the radio room, Funkmott Rolf Schneider encoded the message on the Enigma machine, the rotors clicking with a sound like a ticking clock. He transmitted it in a burst of Morse code, a brief electronic shout into the ether. In Bletchley Park, that shout was intercepted. The complex process of decryption began, but it would take hours. The immediate threat was more direct. 200 miles to the west, the escort group for HX-229 was not what it appeared. The corvette Müller saw was indeed a Flower-class, HMS Dianthus. But ahead of the convoy, invisible in the darkness, steamed the second escort group, led by the destroyer HMS Hesperus. And Hesperus was equipped with the latest HF/DF. Schneider's transmission, though encrypted, was a beacon. The Huff-Duff operator on Hesperus locked onto the bearing almost instantly. On the bridge of Hesperus, Commander Donald McIntyre, a veteran of the Atlantic fight, studied the plot. A bearing line stretched back along the convoy's wake. "He's behind us, shadowing," McIntyre said, his voice calm. "Probably sending for his friends. We'll go have a look." He gave a series of orders. Hesperus and another destroyer, Vanessa, peeled away from the convoy at full speed, their bows slicing through the swells, white water foaming at their stems. They were not chasing a contact. They were homing in on a radio signal. Aboard Humanus 612, the hydrophone operator suddenly sat up straight, his eyes wide behind his headphones. "Propeller noises, Herr Oberleutnant. Fast turbines, bearing 90 closing rapidly." Müller, who had just climbed down from the bridge, felt a jolt of surprise. That was from the front of the convoy. "How many?" "2 at least." "Speed over 20 knots. Impossible." The escorts were supposed to be with the convoy, not charging out into the darkness. "Alarm! Dive! Dive to 90 meters." The alarm klaxon blared, a harsh, urgent sound. Men scrambled. The vents opened with a hiss, and the boat tilted sharply forward as it plunged beneath the waves. The sounds of the sea closed in, the creak of pressure on the hull, the whir of the electric motors. "Depth 90 meters, leveling off," the chief reported. Silence descended, broken only by the ping of their own active sonar, a sound they rarely used for fear of giving away their position. Müller ordered it stopped. They would listen. The hydrophone operator's voice was tense. "The turbines, they've slowed. They're circling, Herr Oberleutnant. Bearing 175, now 210, now 270. They are circling us." A cold trickle of doubt ran down Müller's spine. This was not the behavior of a corvette that had lost contact. This was the methodical search pattern of a hunter who knew its prey was nearby. But how? They had dived within minutes of the transmission. No ASDIC ping had been heard. On the surface, aboard Hesperus, the ASDIC operator called out, "Contact. Submarine bearing 255, range 18 yards, depth estimated 70 meters. McIntyre nodded. He didn't have Hedgehog, but he had an experienced crew and a new tactic. "Prepare depth charge pattern. We'll make a slow, deliberate attack. Let's not rush this." Hesperus moved in, its ASDIC pinging steadily. Below, the pings echoed through the hull of Humanus 612. Ping, 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 each one a hammer blow of anxiety. Müller could picture the destroyer above them, a dark shadow against the lighter surface, its propellers thrumming. "Right full rudder, slow ahead. Let's try to slip out from under him." The boat turned, but the pings followed. The destroyer was matching their turn. "He has us," Lieutenant Berger whispered, his face pale in the red battle lighting. The first pattern of depth charges came. Not the distant thumps of a hasty attack, but a series of carefully placed, ear-shattering explosions that shook the boat violently. Light bulbs shattered. Men were thrown against bulkheads. A pipe in the engine room sprang a leak, spraying a fine mist of water. "Damage report. Minor leaks in the engine room. No critical damage." They had survived the first pass. Standard doctrine was to stay silent and deep. The destroyer would make a few more runs, then likely break off to rejoin the convoy. But Hesperus did not break off. It came around for a second run, and a third. Each pattern was different, probing, trying to box them in. The air in the boat was growing thick, laced with the smell of ozone from electrical shorts and the sharp tang of fear. The crew's initial confidence was gone, replaced by a strained silence. After the fifth attack run, the explosion stopped. The hydrophone operator listened intently. Turbine sounds fading, bearing 340. He is moving away. A collective, shuddering sigh of relief went through the control room. Müller wiped sweat from his forehead. He's returning to the convoy. We'll wait, then surface to recharge and report. They had been lucky. A close call, but they had outwitted the hunter. 20 minutes passed. The silence was profound. Müller was about to give the order to surface when the hydrophone operator stiffened again, his knuckles white on the headset. New contact, high-speed screws, bearing 10, closing very fast. It's the second destroyer. Vanessa had been waiting, holding a distant patrol line. As Humanus 612 began to creep away from Hesperus' last known position, it had moved into her path, and Vanessa had Hedgehog. On the destroyer's bridge, the captain watched the Aztec plot. The operator called the range and bearing with machine-like precision. Fire Hedgehog. With a series of loud whooshes, the 24 bombs arced through the air ahead of the ship, landing in a neat elliptical pattern on the water's surface with a sound like heavy rain. They sank quickly. Aboard Humanus 612, they heard the strange plunks hitting the water, a sound none of them recognized. It was not the splash of depth charges. It was something else. What was that? Berger asked, his voice tight. Müller had no time to answer. A deafening, catastrophic explosion tore through the forward part of the boat. Not a concussive blast from a distance, but a violent, localized detonation that ripped open the pressure hull like a tin can. The shockwave hurled Müller against the periscope housing. Lights went out. The emergency lighting flickered on, revealing a scene from hell. Seawater, under immense pressure, was jetting into the control room from the forward compartment. The screams of wounded men were cut short by the roaring flood. "Blow all ballast! Emergency surface!" Müller screamed, but it was too late. The boat was already nosing down, the weight of the incoming water dragging it toward the abyss. The angle increased steeply. Men lost their footing, sliding toward the bow in a tangle of limbs and equipment. As the cold Atlantic water swirled around his knees, rising with terrifying speed, Hans-Joachim Müller had one last, coherent thought. It wasn't about his crew or his life or his family. It was a professional's realization, a final, devastating piece of analysis. They knew exactly where we were. They waited. They used a weapon we have never heard. This was not luck. This was a trap. The Humanus 612 plunged through the dark water, its hull groaning in its death throes, until it reached a depth where the pressure crushed it into a silent, mangled tomb. On the surface, Vanessa circled the spreading oil slick and debris, confirming the kill. A signal was sent to Commander McIntyre on Hesperus, submarine destroyed, returning to station. The battle for convoy HX-229 would continue for days, with heavy losses on both sides. But the loss of Humanus 612 on April 21, 1943, was a microcosm of the new war. It was not an isolated incident. It was a preview. As May dawned, Admiral Dönitz, convinced the convoy battles were reaching their climax, gathered his largest Wolfpack strength yet for an assault on the slow convoy on Sminus 5. Over 40 U-boats converged on the 43 merchant ships. The Allies, reading their every move via Ultra, reinforced the escort with veteran groups and ensured continuous air cover. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic dismantling. U-boats were sunk by aircraft in broad daylight. Escorts using Hedgehog and the new Squid mortar made kill after kill. The U-boats, trained for the silent night surface attack, found themselves harried, located, and destroyed in a maelstrom of coordinated violence. The reports flooding into BDU in the first week of May were not just of losses. They were of a paradigm shattered. U-boats reported being attacked by aircraft 600 miles from land. They reported escorts that found them with uncanny accuracy even in fog. They reported new, terrifying weapons. The casualty figures were unsustainable. 41 U-boats sunk in May 1943 alone. For the first time, U-boat losses exceeded new launches. The tonnage sunk by the remaining U-boats plummeted. In his headquarters, Dönitz stared at the maps and lost charts. The confidence of April was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrific comprehension. The technological edge had not just been matched, It had been overthrown. The industrial might of America was not producing mere numbers. It was producing a new kind of warfare, a seamless, automated, intelligence-driven system of destruction. The happy time was over. Something had changed, fundamentally and irrevocably. The ocean was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a killing field, and his U-boats were the prey. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz made the only decision he could. He issued the order that would have been unthinkable just 2 months earlier. All U-boats in the North Atlantic are to break off operations against convoys and proceed to safer areas. The withdrawal was temporary, he told his staff in Berlin. They needed to regroup, to deploy new countermeasures like the Aphrodite radar decoy and the Zonkernig acoustic homing torpedo. But as the scattered, shaken U-boats limped back to their bases in France and Norway, their commanders knew the truth in their bones. The war they had trained for, the war they had mastered, was gone. They had laughed at the crude, industrial approach of their enemy. They had believed their skill and courage would always triumph over mass production. They were wrong, and the price of that error was being measured at the bottom of the Atlantic, in the shattered hulls of over 30 submarines and the lost crews of more than 1,000 men. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached its irreversible turning point. The system had triumphed, but for the Germans, the full, horrifying scope of that system, its reach, its precision, its inhuman efficiency, was only beginning to reveal itself. The temporary withdrawal was not a pause. It was an admission of defeat in a campaign they believed they had already won. And the architects of their downfall were already working on the next evolution, a technology that would not just find U-boats, but track them from the sky with a relentless, all-seeing eye, making the oceans truly transparent. The darkest days for the U-boot were not behind them. They were waiting over the horizon, in the form of a radar so advanced it could distinguish a periscope from a wave crest, carried by aircraft that never seemed to land. The hunter was about to become the quarry in a game where the rules were written in a language of science and scale they could no longer understand. The oil slick from Humanus 612 was still spreading, a dark, iridescent stain on the gray Atlantic swell, when the first signals of the coming storm began to crackle through the ether. In the BDU headquarters in Lorient, the mood on May 1st was one of tense expectation, not dread. The massive wolf packs Drossel, Amsel, and Specht, a combined force of over 40 U-boats, were converging on the slow westbound convoy on Smoldering 5. The intelligence seemed perfect. The weather was foul, ideal for U-boats and terrible for aircraft. This, Dönitz believed, would be the knockout blow, the battle that would break the back of the Atlantic convoy system and vindicate his strategy of relentless attack. What he could not see were the lines on the plotting tables in the Western Approaches Command in Liverpool. Lines drawn from the decrypted Enigma signals that flowed from Bletchley Park with only a few hours' delay. The Allies knew the positions of every U-boat group, their patrol lines, and their orders. Convoy on Smoldering 5 was already being shepherded by Commander Peter Gretton's B-7 escort group, a hand-picked team of veterans aboard destroyers and corvettes. Ahead of them, more escorts were being vectored in. Overhead, despite the weather, very long-range VLR liberators from Iceland and Newfoundland were being scrambled, their new centimetric radar sets probing through the rain and fog. The battle opened as the Germans expected. On the night of May 4th, in heavy fog, the U-boats made contact. Kapitänleutnant Karl Eugen Wechter of Humanus 223 slipped inside the screen and fired a spread of torpedoes, sinking 2 merchantmen. The reports crackled back to BDU, contact established, attack successful, convoy at our mercy. The mood in Lorient was jubilant. The old pattern was reasserting itself. But then the fog thickened into an impenetrable blanket. For 2 days the convoy vanished into a murky twilight world. To the U-boat commanders it was frustrating but not alarming. The convoy was blind, hiding. They would find it again. What they did not realize was that the fog was their enemy's ally. It grounded the feared Allied aircraft, but it also forced the U-boats to navigate by hydrophone and dead reckoning, while the escorts, with their superior radar and huff-duff, could still sense the predators circling in the gloom. Aboard Humanus 638, a Type WWII commanded by Oberleutnant Heinrich Kelling, the crew listened to the distant, haunting symphony of convoy screws. The hydrophone operator, Jeffrader Brandt, had an exceptional ear. "I have multiple merchant screws bearing 280, range uncertain in this fog," he reported. "Escort signatures, 1, maybe 2. Faint." Kelling, a young commander on his second patrol, saw his chance. "We will go in on the surface," he decided. "In this fog their lookouts are blind. We can get within 500 meters." The boat crept forward, engines at slow speed, a gray ghost in a gray world. The only sounds were the gentle thrum of the diesel and the drip of condensation from the bridge canopy. They saw nothing but the swirling mist. Kelling's confidence grew. This was the U-boat's element, the unseen approach, the ambush from nowhere. On the bridge of HMS Vidette, a V-class destroyer, Lieutenant Commander Richard Stannard peered into the same fog. His radar screen, however, painted a different picture. A faint, persistent blip appeared at 32 yards, bearing 195. It was small, intermittent, the signature of a submarine conning tower barely breaking the surface. "There's our shadow," Stannard said quietly. He did not sound the alarm or increase speed. Instead, he ordered a slow, deliberate turn, bringing Vidette around in a wide arc, using the fog as cover. He had Hedgehog. He would not waste it with a reckless charge. For 20 minutes, the two vessels moved in a deadly, silent minuet. Kelling, believing himself invisible, closed to what he estimated was torpedo range. He never heard the destroyers approach. The first indication that his world had inverted was the sudden, terrifying sound of fast turbines directly astern, followed immediately by a series of sharp, explosive whooshes from the darkness. The Hedgehog bombs landed in a perfect oval pattern 60 yards off Humanus 638's port beam. They sank silently. Kelling had just enough time to scream, "Alarm!" before the world ended. Two of the bombs struck the pressure hull amidships. The explosions were not the massive crump of depth charges, but two vicious, localized detonations that acted like can openers. Seawater under hundreds of pounds of pressure erupted into the engine room. Humanus 638 sank in less than 30 seconds. There were no survivors. Stannard noted the coordinates of the oil slick and returned to the convoy screen without ever having seen his enemy. The kill was clinical, remote, and utterly efficient. It was the first of many that night. As dawn broke on May 6th, the fog began to lift. The U-boats, sensing their chance, moved in for what they believed would be the final slaughter. What they met was a wall of coordinated violence that defied all their experience. The air, which should have been empty 600 miles from land, was suddenly full of aircraft. A Liberator of No. 120 Squadron, piloted by Flight Lieutenant John Wright, emerged from a cloud layer and spotted Humanus 125 on the surface, recharging its batteries after a night of chasing. Wright's ASV radar had picked up the boat from 8 miles away. He descended through the clouds, switching on the lee light at the last second. The U-boat's crew, blinded by the sudden sun-bright beam, froze for critical seconds. Depth charges tumbled from the Liberator's bay, straddling the submarine. Humanus 125 was left dead in the water, sinking slowly. Nearby, the destroyer HMS Orby spotted the crippled U-boat. Its captain, Lieutenant Commander John Ingram, had no Hedgehog, but he had a new weapon, the Squid, a 3-barreled mortar that fired depth charges ahead of the ship in a pattern that detonated at a set depth. Orby made a single pass. The Squid bombs plunged into the sea and exploded in a coordinated triangle around Humanus 125's estimated position. The submarine vanished in a geyser of water and debris. From initial radar contact to destruction, the entire engagement had taken less than 15 minutes. It was a seamless kill chain. Aircraft to locate and cripple, surface vessel to finish. The reports reaching BDU that day were no longer puzzling anomalies. They were a torrent of catastrophe. U-531 sunk by aircraft. U-438 sunk by the frigate HMS Jed. U-192 sunk by the corvette HMS Loosestrife. The tally mounted with sickening speed. The U-boats were not just being attacked, they were being systematically eradicated. The technological mismatch was now grotesquely apparent. A U-boat commander surfacing to transmit a contact report would find a destroyer bearing down on him within the hour, guided by Huff Duff. A boat trying to stalk the convoy submerged would hear the dreaded plunks of hedgehog or the deeper thumps of squid mortars. Weapons that gave no warning and against which their pillenwerfer decoys were useless. The psychological breakdown among the wolf packs was swift and total. Veteran commanders who had coolly faced depth-charge attacks in 1941 now radioed hysterical, uncoded pleas for help. And being attacked by unknown weapon, aircraft everywhere, cannot surface. Escorts have devil's eyes. The disciplined radio silence of the Rudel tactic dissolved into a cacophony of panic. BDU operators in Lorient could only listen, helpless, as their elite force came apart in real time. By May 8th, the Battle of Onsminus 5 was over. The score was devastating. The convoy had lost 12 merchant ships, a serious blow, but a far cry from the massacres of 1942. In exchange, the Germans had lost 6 U-boats sunk in direct attacks, with another 7 so badly damaged they were forced to abort their patrols. More importantly, the coordinated Wolfpack had been shattered. The U-boats had been outthought, outfought, and outproduced. The system had passed its ultimate test. In Lorient, the atmosphere was funereal. Admiral Dönitz pored over the after-action reports, his face ashen. The numbers were irrefutable. In the first 20 days of May 1943, 41 U-boats had been sunk in the North Atlantic. The loss rate had jumped from 14% of boats at sea in March to over 30% in May. The tonnage sunk per U-boat per day at sea had plummeted from over 200 tons in March to less than 50. The graphs that Fregatenkapitan Ohin had warned about now showed a vertical cliff. On May 24th, Dönitz issued the withdrawal order. It was couched in terms of a tactical regrouping, but every officer who read it understood its true meaning. The North Atlantic, the decisive theater of the naval war, had been conceded. The U-Bootwaff's offensive was broken. The retreat from the North Atlantic was not an orderly withdrawal. It was a rout shrouded in confusion and denial. As the surviving U-boats limped back to their bases in France, their commanders were debriefed by teams of technical experts and staff officers desperate for explanations. The stories they told were consistent and terrifying. Kapitänleutnant Peter Rerich Kremer, whose U-minus 333 had been one of the first to encounter the Lee Light, was now summoned to Berlin. In a stark conference room at the Naval High Command, he stood before a board of senior engineers and admirals. "Describe the light again," demanded Konteradmiral Friedrich Steinhoff, head of Naval Technical Development. "It was not a flare, Herr Admiral," Kremer said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "It was a steady, focused beam, like a searchlight but more intense. It switched on from directly above, at the same moment the depth charges were released. There was no engine sound until the last seconds. The aircraft found us in pitch darkness in a calm sea with no moon. The engineers exchanged glances. One, a civilian from Telefunken, spoke up. The power required for such a light, the weight of the generators, it is not possible for a single-engine aircraft." "It was a twin-engine Wellington," Kremer corrected quietly. "And it is possible because it happened." The evidence was becoming physical. In July, a damaged Lee light-equipped Wellington crash-landed in occupied Norway. German technicians swarmed over the wreckage. The light itself was massive, a 24-inch parabolic reflector with a 20 million candle power carbon arc lamp, powered by a separate generator in the bomb bay. The radar set, the ASV Mark III, was a revelation. It operated on a wavelength of 10 centimeters, a frequency German science had considered impractical for airborne use. Its magnetron valve, a technological marvel, was smaller and more powerful than anything in the German arsenal. A detailed report was sent to Steinhoff. His marginal note in red pencil read, "Jar hinter uns, years behind us." The hedgehog and squid presented a different kind of shock. In August 1943, a German salvage team managed to recover several unexploded hedgehog bombs from the wreck site of a U-boat in the Bay of Biscay. The bombs were taken to a laboratory in Kiel. The chief engineer, Dr. Ernst Fischer, examined the simple, brutal design, a solid steel body with a contact fuse at the front, filled with Torpex explosive. "It is primitive," he noted to his assistant, "but brilliant. They have eliminated the hydrostatic fuse. It only works on direct hit. But to achieve a direct hit," he trailed off, calculating the implications. It meant the Allied sonar was now so precise, their fire control so advanced, that they could aim with pinpoint accuracy. It meant the margin for error for a U-boat was zero. The assistant, a young physicist, said what Fischer was thinking. "Herr Doctor, this weapon does not hunt, it executes." The industrial scale of the defeat was driven home not by spies or aerial reconnaissance, but by the prisoners of war. When the survivors of UMNS 456, sunk in April by a British Sunderland, were transported to a POW camp in Canada, their train passed near the port of Halifax. From their barred windows, they saw a sight that left them silent for hours. The harbor was so crowded with merchant ships that the masts and funnels seemed to form a forest. Tied up alongside the piers were rows of identical, sleek new warships, destroyer escorts, fresh from the shipyards of Boston and New York. One of the prisoners, a machinist's mate named Heinrich Roth, later wrote in his secret diary, "I counted 63 of them from my window. 63. Our intelligence said the Americans could build 60 in a year. I saw more than a year's production in a single harbor on a single day. That is when I knew we were not fighting a navy, we were fighting a law of nature." The German response was a frantic scramble to close a gap that had become a chasm. The technical countermeasures Dönitz had promised were rushed into production. The Aphrodite was a simple balloon with aluminum foil strips, designed to create false radar echoes. It was largely useless against centimetric radar. The Zonkernig Ren T-5 acoustic homing torpedo was a genuine innovation, designed to target the propeller noises of escorts. It scored early successes, sinking several Allied warships in late 1943. But the Allies developed the simple Foxer noisemaker, a set of metal clackers towed behind the ship, which rendered the T-5 obsolete within months. Each German countermeasure was a single, clever tactic. The Allied system absorbed the blow, analyzed it, and generated a counter within weeks. The most profound failure was in the realm of intelligence. Even after the catastrophic losses of May 1943, the idea that Enigma had been broken was considered heretical at the highest levels of the Kriegsmarine. The alternative explanation, that the Allies had developed impossibly good direction finding and radar, was more palatable, as it suggested a technical problem with a technical solution. A secret investigation, led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris's Oberleutnant, concluded in September 1943 that the four-rotor Enigma M4 was mathematically unbreakable with current technology. The report acknowledged possible compromise of short-signal weather codes, but dismissed the systematic breaking of operational traffic. This failure of imagination was perhaps the greatest German defeat of all. They were pouring resources into building a better lock, while the enemy had been reading their mail for years. The human cost of this technological and systemic defeat was etched into the faces of the returning U-boat men. The aces, the proud knights of the deep, were gone. The average life expectancy for a U-boat crewman in late 1943 was now measured in months. The replacements flooding into the training bases at Kiel and Memel were boys, 18 and 19 years old, rushed through abbreviated training courses. They were sent to sea in new type XXI Electroboot, wonder submarines with streamlined hulls and snorkels, designed to fight the new war. But the boats were plagued with technical teething problems, and the boys lacked the iron discipline and instinctive skill of the veterans like Müller. They were operating complex machinery in an environment where a single mistake, a single hour of recharging batteries on the surface, meant death from a sky that was never empty. The perspective from other Axis powers was one of dawning horror and helplessness. In Tokyo, Imperial Japanese Navy attachés received detailed reports from their German allies about the Atlantic disaster. The implications for the Pacific were clear. If the Americans could produce such a system to clear the Atlantic, what were they building for the vast expanses of the Pacific? Japanese submarine commanders, who had also enjoyed early success, began to report eerily similar experiences in late 1943. Sudden, accurate attacks by aircraft far from land, destroyers that found them with inexplicable ease. The Japanese, even more culturally inclined to believe in spiritual superiority over material strength, were slower to understand the systemic nature of the threat. They would pay for that misunderstanding with the near-total annihilation of their submarine force by 1945. For the German High Command, the strategic impact of losing the Atlantic was immediate and catastrophic. The temporary withdrawal in May 1943 became permanent. The flow of American troops and material to Britain, once a perilous trickle, became a torrent. In the 11 months leading up to D-Day in June 1944, not a single troop transport was lost to U-boats in the North Atlantic. The build-up for Operation Overlord proceeded unimpeded. The Allies owned the sea lanes and with them the initiative. The U-boats were forced to the fringes, to the Arctic, the Indian Ocean, the Caribbean. They became mere commerce raiders, not war winners. Their successes were isolated, their losses constant. The introduction of the snorkel in 1944 allowed them to stay submerged longer, but it turned them into blind, slow-moving targets, tethered to a pipe that left a visible wake and a clear radar signature. The final evolution of the Allied system, the aircraft-mounted magnetic anomaly detector, and the FIDO airdropped homing torpedo, made even a submerged submarine vulnerable to aircraft. The ocean had become truly transparent. The numbers tell the story of a force annihilated by a system. When war began in September 1939, Germany had 57 U-boats. During the war, it commissioned 1,162. Of these, 785 were destroyed. The casualty rate among crewmen was approximately 75%, the highest of any service in any nation during the war. In the pivotal year of 1943, German shipyards launched 284 new U-boats. That same year, Allied forces sank 237. For the first time, kills were exceeding production, and Allied production was on another plane entirely. In 1943 alone, American shipyards launched 1949 Liberty ships and 306 destroyer escorts. The United States was building a Liberty ship faster than Germany could build a single U-boat, and an escort vessel every day. The fate of the men who had been the sharp point of the spear was varied, and often bleak. Of the aces who had sunk over 100,000 tons, most were dead by 1944. Otto Kretschmer, the top ace, had been captured in 1941. Erich Topp survived the war. Peter Rerich Kremer, who had warned about the Lee Light, commanded the new Humanist 2519, a Type XXI in the war's final days, never firing a shot in anger. Admiral Dönitz would become Hitler's successor for 7 days in May 1945, before surrendering the Third Reich and later standing trial at Nuremberg. And what of the legacy of Hans-Joachim Müller and the Humanist 612? His final realization in the flooding control room, this was not luck. This was a trap, was the epitaph for the entire U-WWII. He had understood in his last seconds the fundamental shift. He had been outmatched not by a braver captain or a luckier crew, but by a vast, impersonal, and relentless system. His war of individual skill and courage had been rendered obsolete by a new paradigm of industrialized, intelligence-driven warfare. The wreck of Humanist 612 still lies somewhere on the Atlantic floor, a crushed steel coffin for its 51-man crew. It is one data point among hundreds, a silent testament to the moment the tide turned. The system that destroyed it, the marriage of ultra-intelligence, centimetric radar, mass-produced escorts, and a head-thrown weapons, did more than win the Battle of the Atlantic. It established the template for modern military dominance, the integration of surveillance, precision strike, and networked command and control. The Germans had perfected the art of the duel. The Allies invented the science of the kill chain. In the end, the most poignant perspective comes not from a grand admiral or a brilliant engineer, but from a common sailor. In a POW camp in Arizona in 1945, a survivor of Humanist 373, sunk by a hedgehog attack in June 1944, was asked by his American interrogator why he thought Germany lost the U-boat war. The sailor, a young radioman named Joseph, thought for a long moment. He had no access to statistics, no knowledge of Bletchley Park or the Kaiser shipyards. His answer was born of lived experience, of nights spent trembling beneath the ping of sonar and the strange plunks of unknown weapons. "You could not hide," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Before, the sea was a friend. It hid you. Then one day it became glass. They could see you through it. They could see you in the dark, in the fog, deep under the water. You would be alone in the middle of the ocean and they would find you, not by looking, by calculation. It was like being hunted by mathematics." He paused, looking out at the desert, so alien compared to the gray Atlantic of his memory. "We were sailors," he said. "They were accountants, and the accountants won.